Welcome back to the Chad Hasty Show on News Talk 95.1 FM and 790 AM. KFYO. Joining us on the phones right now, coming to us from a city under siege, from South by Southwest scooters and long-shot Democrat presidential hopefuls, it's the editor of Quorum Report, Scott Braddock. Scott, good morning. How are you today?
I'm doing great, but I just want to put out the word. No one else come to Austin. No one else come here. Thank you.
I heard that to take an 8-mile trip on I-35, we're up to, 24 hours now, right?
Exactly, yes. I think the easiest way to get from North Austin to South Austin right now is to drive to Houston first and then make your way back over.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Sounds like a good way of going. It's kind of the perfect storm for Austin right now because the schools are the schools still in session in Austin?
Yeah, so spring break is a little different. Usually you would have spring break going on so the kids would be out at UT, and you have everything happening at once, South by Southwest, kids in school, the legislature's going on. We're out of bandwidth here.
Yeah, I'm
officially out of bandwidth.
I'm glad I came in 2 weeks ago. I'm glad I did not bother with coming in this past weekend.
Yeah, you missed this whole thing, and I'll tell you the greatest irony of all is, and you know, and the listeners know, I've been sort of at war with these scooters here, as you alluded to. Well, they banned the scooters along 6th Street in Austin. Of course, one of the big tourist draws is 6th Street.
Right.
And they banned the scooters just the other day. APD, the police department out there, gathering up the scooters, impounding them along 6th Street. And there was a crowd there just applauding as the police were gathering up these scooters. Well, the irony is that you do have a street where they can't use the scooters, but I can't get to that street. There's too much traffic between my office and where that street is. So
yeah.
There's a little scooterless oasis right now that is just a mirage for me.
That no one can get to.
No,
let's stay on the topic of South by Southwest just for a little
sure.
bit before we get into some legislative news. As I said, you had some of the Democrat, really a lot of them were the long shot Democrats who turned out to South by Southwest and really dominated this weekend's coverage of South by Southwest. What do you take away from that? I guess Julian Castro, at least in Texas, is the biggest name that was on that list. I think Elizabeth Warren stopped by as well. Any juice among any of those candidates who are hanging out this weekend?
I mean, I guess there's some juice, but I would say to temper the whole thing about whether they're interested in Texas so much. Look, South by Southwest is an international stage. If you come to South by Southwest as a candidate, and when this festival first started out, when it was just a music festival years and years ago, the organizers at the time, they called it South by So What, because nobody cared about it. But now South by Southwest has grown into this international brand, as we say, and people are coming, candidates are coming to South by Southwest in Austin, not because they're campaigning in Texas, but because they want to be on television all across the country, which of course they got. And if you look at Julian Castro and his performance on CNN, for example, he was taking Bernie Sanders to task about what Sanders had said about whether there should be reparations for slavery. I mean, they were going back and forth about whether there ought to be a big check written to the African-American community for that. Bernie Sanders saying no, that they shouldn't, and Castro saying that it's interesting that a guy like Sanders, who thinks it's okay to write a big check for Medicare for all and wants to write a big check for all sorts of other government programs, doesn't want to write a big check when it comes to reparations. So you look at that, and then you look at all the other arguments that are being made by Senator Warren, who you mentioned, Pete Buttigieg, if I'm saying his name anywhere close to right.
That's how you say his
Indiana
name.
mayor.
Okay.
I think that's close to right. So they were calling him Mayor Pete, this guy who's the South Bend, Indiana mayor. All these sort of long shots, like you say, they're all trying to out-liberal each other. I mean, if you think about a Democratic primary as sort of the political photo negative of a Republican primary, what do they do in the Republican primary? Everybody tries to be the most conservative. You've never met anybody more conservative than me if I'm running in a Republican primary. And on the other side, they try to be the most liberal. I mean, that's where they're at. And you also in Austin, you had AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who has been, not running for president, but she's certainly moving the conversation more to the left within the Democratic Party. And one of the things she said here at South by Southwest, which, by the way, an interesting comment from her, saying that capitalism is irredeemable, and then, of course, every candidate who's running for president then has to answer the question about whether they agree with that, if they're a Democrat, whether they are a capitalist or a socialist. Of course, she was saying capitalism is irredeemable during an event that I think generates for about $350 million for the Austin economy every year.
Yeah, just a little bit of money, but capitalism is irredeemable.
Yes, well, she was also asking where to get this, purchase the best tacos in Austin before she was coming here.
No, they're free tacos.
Little competition. By the way, my answer, of course, is San Antonio.
Very nice.
That's where South by Southwest should be held.
That's where you want to move it to, is San Antonio.
Yes, sir. Sounds good to me.
Yeah. Let's see. Let's get it. That's going to be a busy week, it looks like, in the legislature.
Yeah, no question. On the floor of the Texas Senate, as soon as today, we may see the ban on government-mandated paid sick leave, which we've talked about here on the program. Democrats in Austin and San Antonio pushed these ordinances at the local level that say that private employers can be fined up to $500 per violation if they don't offer paid sick leave to their employees. So local government, issuing regulations here that, in some folks' estimation, get in the way of the employer-employee relationship. Business groups are trying to figure out whether or not this is going to pass as originally proposed. There is a version in the House that's a little bit different. I think that the version that's in the Senate is on track to be passed in the Senate this week. But as you know, as we've talked about, they don't really get these sorts of things done unless both chambers, the House and Senate, can agree on exactly what the language ought to be, and there are some significant differences right now.
Is there any movement right now in the House on this, or is this something that is not as big of a priority in the House?
It's absolutely a priority, and remember, the governor had offered his full-throated support for this. Now, it's not one of his emergency items, but he did say during a luncheon a few weeks ago to the NFIB, which of course represents small business, had said that, look, it's not that paid sick leave is a bad thing. He's just saying that it ought to be something that is up to each individual business as far as whether they want to use it as a recruiting tool. On the Democratic side, on the liberal side, what they argue is that look, you have so many working families who are just out of reach a lot of times for making their situation better, and somebody will either get sick in their home or they get sick themselves, and they're not compensated for the time that they either take off to get themselves better or get a family member better. And I do think to the politics of this, Chad, it may be a pretty good organizing principle for Democrats, actually, in Texas. If you look at the history of Democrats being able to win elections in this state, a lot of times, you go back several decades, and it was these sort of labor issues that folks would really get fired up about. And, if you look at some of the competitive districts in the Texas House last year, Paul Workman is a former Republican member of the Texas Legislature, former House member, who had taken a hard stance against what Austin was doing when it comes to mandating paid sick leave for people, and they beat him by about 5 points in his race. And you might say, well, that's one of those competitive districts, but that's sort of the point. There are at least 6 districts around the state where there's a Republican in the seat in the Texas House, but that person won their seat last year by 3 points or less. And I think when you start to layer on various issues, you got President Trump at the top of the ticket. That's going to drive a lot of Democratic turnout, and then we'll see exactly who runs against Senator John Cornyn. That will also be a factor, and then Democrats will also start making arguments, about these things like paid sick leave, which I think in the past would have been kind of a slam dunk for a Republican legislator to just be against it. But if you're in one of those swing districts, it might be something you have to take a close look at, and maybe you can't do it the same way that you had before.
Yeah, maybe in the coming weeks we'll kind of compare the Senate version and the House version. Mm-hmm. One thing that we had the bill filing deadline that happened on Friday of last week, and I think we finally saw a school finance plan from the Texas Senate, correct?
We do have a plan from them, although it's full of blanks. And what I mean by that is there's really no numbers in it. The Texas House plan lays out $9 billion in various ways of spending money or buying down property taxes. And the Texas Senate plan, SB 4, doesn't have numbers in it. It looks like sort of a placeholder for what their eventual school finance plan is going to be. It's important to remember that Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick has laid down a real marker here, which is he's saying, and he said this on Friday after the bill was filed, he said if you want to really tackle school finance, the first thing you have to do is pay teachers more, and the Senate has already, of course, passed that teacher pay raise, $5,000 per teacher, and that, I believe, is where the Senate is really going to focus their efforts. You also have a bill that was filed by Senator Paul Bettencourt from Houston, which will expand the homestead exemption. So it may be that that's their real plan, as far as what they intend to do with school finance. Politically, it's pretty smart. I mean, look, the House plan is complicated. It has to do with reducing recapture payments for various districts, and dealing with the Robin Hood school finance system, and all those things that are sort of unpopular with people, but are sort of are complicated.
Yeah.
It's real easy to understand what the Senate is doing. They're spending $4 billion to give teachers pay raises, and that was a campaign promise of Lieutenant Governor Patrick, although it's worth saying that his promise during the campaign was to give them raises of $10,000, and this raise is $5,000. As we talked about last week, the $5,000 raise for every teacher in Texas takes up about half of what the budget surplus is this year. To do the $10,000 raise would be all of it.
Well, and okay, so this seems to me as it's going to be the first real blow-up maybe between the House and the Senate is school finance, because it seems like it's two totally different pathways to getting to school finance. Is that correct?
I think that's fair. Oftentimes when you see these different proposals rolled out, the first thing you'll notice is that they're just not even talking about the same things. You have Bonin talking about reducing recapture payments and giving pay raises to employees at school districts, but letting the school districts figure out exactly how they should do that. And on the Senate side, you have the senators agreeing with popular sentiment, which is that teachers ought to make more, and putting forward a very sort of simple plan that says, I don't know if you can even call it a plan, but basically a simple proposal that says teachers will get a pay raise. And how they work out those differences, that's the real meat of the session. I mean, we're really getting into it now. Now that we are in March, and the bill filing deadline has passed, you see, where the real divisions are and how they're going to work it out. I mean, and I've covered enough of these to remember that it didn't seem like, with 77 days to go right now, didn't seem like they would be able to work out the differences, but guess what? Eventually they always do, but the reason we tune in and figure out, exactly what's going on each day is because the way they work it out is going to impact how we all live our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. You've got teachers who are going to be rallying at the Texas Capitol today.
Yeah, they're rallying for a variety of things, including more pay for teachers, but also rallying against the idea that that money for schools ought to be based simply on, and we'll talk more about this in the weeks to come, I'm sure, the idea that money for schools ought to be based on how the students do on those assessments, which, of course, every member of the legislature has heard this, and it doesn't matter if they're a Democrat, Republican, if they're conservative, liberal, or somewhere in between. Every member of the legislature has heard from parents who think that the kids take too many damn tests, is the way they all put it. Yeah. So reforming that is something else that they may have to take a look at here.
Visiting with Scott Braddock, editor of Quorum Report. Before I let you go, Scott, when I was down in Austin, had the Speaker Pro Tem, Joe Moody, on my show, and we talked about his bill, HB 63, which, it would... He didn't really like calling it decriminalization because there's still a fine and a penalty if you're caught with a small amount of marijuana. But I know that there was a hearing on that last week, I believe, and there are some other pieces of legislation dealing with marijuana, correct?
There are, there's one piece of legislation that is marijuana related. You remember a couple of sessions ago, there was a bill passed by Stephanie Click. She's a Republican from Fort Worth, and that bill allows for this cannabis oil, this CBD oil, to be administered to children with intractable epilepsy. She has a bill that would expand the group of people who are able to receive that sort of treatment, and that's something that's gaining some steam. And this idea of decriminalization versus legalization, Joe Moody doesn't like that term, decriminalization. Right now, you do have sheriff's departments in Texas that will give you a ticket and not take you to jail if you are caught with a small amount of marijuana. I know they do that here in Travis County and down in Bexar County where San Antonio is. So law enforcement does have that discretion right now. What Moody's bill would do is basically say that they wouldn't have the discretion anymore. They would basically have to cite you and release you.
Are these bills, though, with obvious, Republican control, and Republicans have not been that embracing of, of even medical marijuana here in Texas, are these bills likely to go anywhere?
Well, it seems like there's at least a different environment. Of course, in the Republican Party of Texas platform, they did take a softer stance last year on the issue of marijuana, and this is something that's sort of telling. There is a new group out there that is pushing for reform of medical marijuana, and one of the key members of that group is the top strategist for Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, a guy named Alan Blakemore from Houston. And so the idea that, one of the top consultant for one of the most conservative state leaders is now involved in this, that might be a tell about where this is going to go.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Scott Braddock, editor of Quorum Report. Scott, tell folks what they can find on Quorum Report today.
Well, they can track this paid sick leave debate. That'll be happening potentially in real time this afternoon. We do have a full report about what we were just talking about with the medical marijuana laws and other marijuana laws as well. And we will have a side-by-side comparison of exactly what is in the House and Senate plans on school finance. I know people want to get down into the weeds about that. They can check it out at quorumreport.com.
Very good. Scott, as always, appreciate it. Good luck getting around Austin today, and we'll visit with you next week.
We'll give it a shot, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks,
All right. Thanks, Scott. That's Scott Braddock, editor of Quorum Report. You can follow him on Twitter at Scott Braddock. Chad Hasty Show, KFYO.